All right, gang. Welcome to the May 31st edition, the Mac Forum video chat. My apologies. The last 2 weeks we've been out of commission on a temporary hiatus, so to speak. We had a few other activities going on and wasn't able to have the time to put a show together. I hope you will make up. I hope this show will kind of start to make up for that. The summer break is kind of starting for me, so we'll have some things going on probably each week this summer. I'm going to try to squeeze in some longer um, things, how-to tips and things, probably starting next week, and try to squeeze in a little bit of writing for the blog over the summer. Maybe we'll catch up on some things that I've kind of had on the back burner for a while. Couple of things I want to be sure and mention. We now have just over 300,000 members, 300,688 to be exact. And our newest is Kurt J, I believe, if I didn't misread that earlier when I looked everything up. And so welcome to them and to the rest of our new members. I hope that you are enjoying your time in Mac Forum and that you're finding a lot of useful information. Keep the questions coming. We'll make sure to put on an extra pot of coffee for the moderators and some of our longtime members who are really good at answering questions. We'll be around, as you may have noticed. No matter what time of night you post a question, there's probably somebody on that can answer it, given the worldwide nature of the forum. Some of our members, as the North American contingent is going down for the evening, our Aussie and some European contingent, they're pretty much just getting started for the day. So that usually works to your advantage if you're looking for an answer. Sometimes if you're asking a particularly difficult question, it may be a while before you get an answer, but usually there'll be one forthcoming in a relatively short period of time. On this week's show, I thought I'd mention a couple of things, just kind of a news roundup and a couple of tips. Most of the news things that I noticed today come, or in the last day or so, have come from Cult of Mac. Right now, most recent posts in the last day or two have been focused on various aspects of the Apple Watch. We'll get into that a little bit. A little bit of some changes in the design team there at Apple, what that might mean, and a little bit of information where you can find some information about one of the people who may be moving up to kind of head up that team a little bit. We'll get to that in just a minute. Also, we'll have one or two tips this week that kind of focus on the Apple Watch, but do want to also include just a kind of a general tip for the Mac, particularly for those of you that are maybe new to the forum and have not posted before. I want to tell you where you can find the information that we seem to consistently ask for when we're trying to solve problems. One of the things that's consistently asked for is going to be various aspects about your system configuration, and we'll tell you where to find that in case you're new to the operating system and where to look. All right, so let's get on with the show. Enough of the preliminaries and housekeeping and things like that. Let's get on with the show. As I mentioned, we have 300,688 members. And hopefully they'll find this information interesting. First of all, Cult of Mac. Buster Hain, I hope I'm not mispronouncing his name, has reviewed kind of or discussed a little bit some information about the Apple Watch and the possibility that at the upcoming Worldwide Developer Conference that Apple is going to preview a way for third-party developers to have a little more direct access to the Apple Watch. It says, VP of Operations Jeff Williams says that Apple will give developers a preview of native Apple Watch apps at the Worldwide Developer Conference, which comes up in about the middle of this month. Currently, Apple's own watch apps run natively, but some third-party apps do not. And that can cause a few hang-ups with the apps. You don't have direct access to some of the sensors. You don't have some other direct access things. So that could be an interesting problem. And I think that's going to help. There have been some complaints in various places about the speed of the watch. Well, this direct access may help a little bit with some of those apps. But where it will also help a little bit, and this comes from a slightly different, Cult of Mac also had an article. If you look through their list of Apple Watch stuff from the past week or so, they were talking about one of the things that they wish that the watch had was direct access to GPS. GPS data, and there were some other things. There was an article there on the Cult of Mac site discussing, I believe it was 5 or 6 things that the writer wished that the Apple Watch included. And one of them was the GPS information. Basically, in this case, what's happening, the author was an avid hiker and make use of the GPS data that some of the fitness bands and watches, such as those presented by Garmin, provide for them. And yeah, you can make use of the GPS on the phone and link it with the watch, but that's not a good solution either if you're hiking out in the middle of nowhere where access is a little limited. But some of the complaints that this gentleman had may be resolved by third-party developers having more direct access to the watch. So it will be interesting to see. That's one of the things that I'll be looking at with a little bit of curiosity when the developer conference comes around. Initially, I used to not pay much attention to Worldwide Developer Conference. I almost never watched it live. I would wait until after the WWDC and see what hardware changes were announced in the new Macs, particularly if I was in the market to purchase one. Well, I haven't purchased a new Mac in about 8 years. Well, 7 years now. We're fast approaching my last actual Mac purchase was 2008, November, December 2008. So that gives you an idea. But I find that now I am watching the developer conference keynotes as they occur, particularly for a couple things. A few years ago, I started working on a different forum, strictly as volunteer, much like Mac Forum, where we were answering questions from members, and some of them with varying degrees of Mac experience. And inevitably, when WWDC came around, there would be some discussion of the various bits of information that were presented in the keynote. And it became necessary to kind of, in order to be able to comment on it coherently, to be able to know what was happening. And you couldn't really wait because, I mean, the comments seemed to start flooding in almost before the keynote was over. You know, there'd be some announcement and somebody would say, oh, I hate this part of the announcement, or I hate this part, or this is really cool. And so I started paying a little more attention to the keynote. I haven't even checked the date yet. As it gets closer, I'll pay closer attention to it. Haven't checked the rumors. I do have a couple of things that I'm kind of expecting to come out of the keynote, but we'll get to that in just a second. Some of the other things that we see that are coming up this week that Cult of Mac discussed a little bit. Johnny Ive, the Apple design guru, he's being promoted, so to speak. And the person that will be taking his place is a gentleman by the name of Richard Howarth. I hope I'm not mispronouncing that. Anyway, Mr. Ive apparently is being promoted into a position which will give him a little more time to, as one site put it, do a little more of the pie in the sky design kind of thinking. Now, the gentleman that's taking Ive's place is this Richard Howarth. Has some design experience. He interned at Sony for a while. At a time, I believe they were working on something similar to the Walkman mini disc at the time. He has been involved with Apple going back a number of years, going back to the first iPhone. And the 4S, apparently, the iPhone 4S is one that he apparently had quite a bit of input on, because at one point, the original concept was to make the iPhone, as some of you will remember, the original iPhone was basically an extruded piece of aluminum, almost a single piece thing. And the original idea, which this gentleman was involved with, was to kind of make a sandwich. The top and the bottom, if you remember the design of the 4S, the top and the bottom of the phone case with that sort of band in the middle, well, that idea had been around since the first generation iPhone. The reason they didn't do it that way in the beginning is that they couldn't, among other things, they could not produce something that was as thin as they wanted with that kind of form factor. And that was one of the issues. Well, he's been around doing iPhone design and some other things for an extended period of time. So we'll be curious to see what becomes of that and what design changes are coming. And also I'll have a link to that article because it gives you a little bit of a summary about his career and his design background. I think it's kind of interesting. I don't normally pay attention to the executive changes that Apple makes. I don't know why that one caught my eye, but it kind of did. And design is something, how do I put this? Design is something that really has become an important part of the way Apple functions. I'll give you an idea of what I mean. When the original iMac came out, the gumdrop iMacs and the like, they got a lot of press when they came out. And that was both good for Apple and to some extent bad. The good thing was it came along at a time when Apple could use the press and have used the good press. And any company will tell you that if you can generate news stories that are positive without paying ad dollars for them, that's a good thing. Anytime the press is talking about your company in a positive way, that's a good thing. Because that's ad dollars that you don't have to spend. But when the gumdrop iMacs came out, that was the first time that I remember where the press was really actively talking about Apple, and I don't just mean the tech press, people who were paid to write on technology. This is just reporters from local papers to national papers, just about anybody with a column was talking about Apple. And whenever they talked about these iMacs, almost inevitably, the article almost immediately turned to the design. Now the upside of that is it created a lot of buzz. There was no other computer around at the time that I can think of that had that kind of eye-catching form factor. And then you had the Dome iMac. Once again, nobody that I can think of had that kind of form factor. And then and unfortunately, the downside to that was that a lot of the writing had very little to do with the technicalities of the Mac, which might have been a good thing, but it didn't talk about the capability. It was all design. And then even when the first generation iPhone came out, much of that talk of that, yes, it talked about technicalities and capability and all of these things, but a lot of the talk focused on how the iPhone differed from the BlackBerry and some of the other devices that were out at the time, differing in terms of usability. So design's been a big thing. So I'll be curious to see what comes out of the Design Works now, that there's been a little bit of shuffling there. I don't expect major changes. I mean, we're not going to suddenly go back to things with, you know, the pizza box type designs of the old LCs, or, you know, any of those 2CIs, if you remember those. But I will be curious to see where Apple goes next in terms of form factor on their computers and other things, because they've really shifted in the last couple of years to things that are lighter, thinner, fewer ports. If you've gotten a look at the newest line of the MacBook Mini, where they've got that one USB-C port, and you use various dongles to connect different kinds of devices. I'm still working out whether I like that one mentally, but that's one choice that they've made. But that was an interesting read. And now for a couple of tips that I want to be sure I squeeze in. I'm not going to go through all of the specifics and steps. I'll post a link to the article that talks about this. I think that'll be easier. Sometimes with the tips, it's hard to read them, explain them in a video without doing a screencast, which I may start doing soon. But one of the things that happens sometimes, first one has to do with Apple Pay. Which, it's curious, it's really taken off quite a bit, and it seems like every day I'm seeing more and more information about a new provider that's accepting Apple Pay, and, which is great. If you, I haven't started using Apple Pay, but if you've used a debit card, for example, you know that there are times when you go to pay for something, say over the internet or something of that nature, and the person that you're talking to, especially over the phone or in a restaurant or somewhere, may ask you for the last 4 digits of the card number. Well, when you're using Apple Pay, that doesn't quite work as well, unless you remember the digits assigned to that card. Apple Pay, the reason it doesn't work is because what Apple Pay does for a security reason, the information about your card is encrypted in a chip on the device. It's not even stored on Apple's server. So the question is, how do you get at that information? Well, the card that's stored in association with Apple Pay is stored in as a device, on the device, as an account number, called the device account number. That number contains 4 digits of the card number, credit card number associated with the account. But that comes in handy if you do not remember the 4 digits. But you have to know how to get at it. I'll post an article there. One of the reasons everybody, and you may ask, well, why isn't it stored on Apple's server? Well, I kind of like the fact that it's not stored on Apple servers, because that means that a data breach is not going to get at all of the information that's needed. That's one less place where that information is stored. Well, I suspect that's a security choice that they made, and I'm okay with that. So I'll post a link in the show notes in a little bit about how you do that, how you get at that information if you happen to have to need to see it, and a couple of other things related to the Apple Watch. Now, with Apple Pay, you're not specifically tied to the watch, okay? But that tip can apply to any device with Apple Pay. But here are a couple specific to the watch. Once again, these come from various writers at Cult of Mac, and I'll have a link to all of these with greater detail. These couple of tips. The first one is when you're using the Apple Watch, okay, and you notice that there's an update available, you get ready to start the update, okay, and at some point you discover that the update seems to have hung. There's no progress being made. You're kind of wondering, why in the heck has this not happened? Well, judging from a thread that from something I saw on Cult of Mac, and it's based on some comments on the Apple discussion site, one reason for this could be, and this is something that may not be as well documented as it should be, is that if you are not in range of a Wi-Fi network, you may get a hang-up in the download and installation of the update if you're not getting a good signal. So you want to always be sure, whenever you start an update, I think you should always be sure that you are within range of a good Wi-Fi signal. I know for me, I've noticed, although my signal is better since I changed carriers, there are some dead spots sometimes, and it's kind of interesting, the nature of radio signal in general being that, I can be in one place today and get a really good signal, and tomorrow signal may be okay for some things, but not okay for downloading. So that's one of the things that you kind of want to keep in mind. Make sure that you've got a good, strong signal when you're doing these kinds of downloads and updates. I know for me, this has been true for the Apple TV because it connects to my network wirelessly. If I'm ever in a situation where I do not have a strong wireless signal, I have had it hang up before. So it makes sense to me that essentially the same situation would occur with the watch. Okay, so you want to make sure you're aware of that. We went through and we talked about some of the things with the Apple Watch, other things with the Apple Watch in terms of some things that people thought needed to be there that aren't. As I say, I'll post an idea to Cult of Mac about that as well. And that seems to have covered a lot of the things that we wanted to talk about tonight. Do want to point out a couple of Mac-related things before we go. Some of you who, with the advent of 10.10.3, you're seeing Photos, which is the new photo application, being used instead of iPhoto. A number of people have reported that they're getting an idea where they can't use iPhoto because it has a line through it, that sort of prohibition line drawn through it, the no symbol. That seems to happen if you do not have the current version of iPhoto installed. The fix that has been reported for that, I have not personally tried this one, but it seems to work. It's go in and delete iPhoto. That does not delete your library, but delete iPhoto and go back to your history in the Apple Store and re-download it. And that will get you the most recent version. Couple of other notes, as I've said before, some of you may have noticed there's some things I really like about the way Photos behaves. If you've used any of the photo editing apps on the iPhone or the iPad, some things about Photos are going to be very common to you. You'll pick up very quickly. It's taken some getting used to. I suspect that as the application matures, there's going to be more and more features added. I don't have anything to base that on other than the fact that that's not uncommon for the Apple and most software companies have a history of doing that. The initial release of a program has a certain feature set, and as the program matures, they get more feedback from users. You get more in the way of features added to the program. One thing that you cannot do right now, or at least if you can do it, I haven't figured out how, is with iPhoto. If you needed more editing capability than iPhoto offered, you could click on a photo and basically send that photo to an external photo editor, like Photoshop or something of that nature. Right now, there doesn't appear to be a way to do that in Photos. If you're going to do some serious editing, you're probably going to have to load that picture into a different photo editor rather than essentially calling out, so to speak, to that program. That probably will change, but once again, I don't have anything to base that on other than a guesswork on my part and looking at the way various other Apple applications have matured over the years. I think it's going to be, there are a lot of things that I like about Photos so far. Several of the things that I used to use, okay, now my knowledge of Photoshop is, I'm by no means a Photoshop maven, okay? My thing with Photoshop is do it by the poke at it with a sharp stick method. You keep messing around with it until you get something that you find helpful. Well, what I notice is that quite a few of the things that I used to do with plugins in Photoshop, I'm getting similar results in a shorter period of time using Photos. Now, I'm not doing serious photo editing. It's mainly some cleanup stuff here and there, a little bit of color correction. Even on my older MacBook Pro, the changes seem to show up on the screen faster than they did with most of the versions of Photoshop that I work with, and most of the Photoshop plugins that I work with. So it's a little easier for me when I'm working with plugins, because I tend to do it by the poke at it with a sharp stick method. If it takes a long time for those corrections to show on screen, by the time they show up, I've either overcorrected or undercorrected because I just don't have the patience to sit there and wait for the redraw. I know that's on me, but I find that Photos responds reasonably quickly. I'm gonna, as I start experimenting with it a little bit more now that summer's come, I'm sure I'll find a lot more in the way of things it can do and things that it's going to need a little help for. as is the case with most applications. I think there are going to be some situations where it's going to be really good, and some situations where I'm going to want to use something else. So we'll see what happens with that and how that goes. I want to, just as a final note, pass on something just real quickly. Once again, a little bit of speculation on my part. I don't, with the when I was reading earlier the descriptions about some of the things that Apple was expected to announce at Worldwide Developer Conference, being expected to announce that they're going to open things and have a little more leeway for third-party applications to run natively. It got me to thinking, I haven't started reading the speculation yet about what's supposed to be announced at Worldwide Developer Conference, and I may not, because quite frequently that information is either wrong, partially wrong, or so wildly speculative as to not be of much help one way or the other. But there are a couple of things that I'm personally expecting, just because of the way things have worked out in the last few years. It would not surprise me if we hear a little bit more about the next incarnation of OS X. I don't know what place name they're going to pick next, but I know it won't be something like OS X Death Valley, but whatever they pick, I suspect that the announcement will be something to give us an idea of what features they will add next. I will probably check out the keynote live. That's usually shown both on the Apple site, and if you have Apple TV, they usually have a link to the keynote that pops up on the Apple TV. As I say, the last couple of years I've watched the keynote, and last year I was glad I did. Even if you're not a tech head, the one thing about the keynote that's kind of interesting, at the time, let me give you an idea of what I mean. At the time, I was running iOS 7 on my phone. I knew that I was going to update to the newest version of OS X when it came out, if my computer could handle it. And I was perfectly happy with iOS 7. I had heard or read some information about what was supposed to be available in iOS 8, but I just wasn't sure it was worth what it was going to cost me to upgrade. Given I would have had to upgrade the phone, upgrade my wife's phone, and some other things. And then I watched the keynote, and two things caught my attention that I had read about, but it's not that I didn't believe what I had read. What I had read was a little confusing, and I had to see it in action to understand it. The first was this idea of starting a FaceTime call on my phone and being able to pick it up on the Mac without switching off and changing and doing a bunch of jumping through a bunch of hoops. That struck me as a really good idea, but I don't make a ton of FaceTime calls. The one that really stuck in my head, though, was being able to pick up with the iPad where I left off viewing something on the Mac. And the reason that was a big deal to me is I had mentioned in the forum a few months before that one of the problems I had was that sometimes I would start reading a list of posts. I'd go and click new post, look at the list of posts that had been made since whenever I last visited, and start clicking through them. I usually try to go through all of them. Sometimes I don't make it, but I usually try to go through all of them in case I know the answer. And if I don't know the answer, I'll probably learn something. Well, the problem was, let's say I go through 5 or 10 of the posts and read through the threads and answer a couple of them. And now I need to shift away from the Mac to the iPad. If I log into Mac Forum on the iPad, the list of new posts is not the same as it was on my Mac. So if, let's say, I started writing a post on the Mac and couldn't finish it, had to walk away from it a little bit, and I try to finish it on the iPad, it's not there, you know, in an easy way. Well, handoff kind of takes care of that. And being able to pick up where I left off, so to speak, takes care of that. If I'm searching for something on the Mac and I switch over to the iPad, I don't have to re-enter the search and guess which one I was using. The list is there. I can kind of pick it up. So, and I didn't fully understand how that operated and what it meant in terms of ease and usability until I saw it at the keynote. Once I saw it live, now that's just me. There are some things that in order to understand them, I have to see them. And so that to me is a good reason for watching the keynote. My first incarnation of watching the iPad was at the keynote. I wasn't planning on buying one. My wife saw the keynote and said this would be a good way for you not to bring your laptop to work. And that's how I ended up with the very first generation iPad. So, you know, sometimes you really need to see how something works in order to really truly get a feel for it. So I hope that you'll keep an eye out for the keynote when it becomes available. I'm sure there will be a link posted in the forum. I'm thinking about, if I can get enough of the guys together, maybe hosting a video chat on the day of the keynote. Either do the chat as the keynote is going on or immediately after. I'll let you know if we can get some of our more knowledgeable members involved. I don't want to be the only one doing it. I think you need to hear somebody else's opinion as well. But I'll be curious to see if I can get enough guys involved with that. And if I do, I'll let you know. We'll have the time and everything. And you can tune in and perhaps chime in. So that'll be one thing that might keep your interest this summer. As I mentioned, I think I'll have a few other projects that I'll mention to you as the summer goes along. But for now, I think that's going to do it for tonight's broadcast. I hope that you've enjoyed the show. I'll have, as I say, I'll have the links up. Next week, we'll probably have more in the way of tips and tricks. We'll have a little more time to spend on that. But we'll go ahead and have what the links that I have for the stories that I talked about. We'll have those up shortly, both in the Mac Forum Sunday chat thread and on the page where the chats appear, on the Google Plus page, the Hangout page where the chats occur. So I'm looking forward to working on these chats a little bit this summer, maybe coming up with some new things that we can add to it. Hope that you have enjoyed this one. And until next Sunday, we'll see you on the Mac Forum video chat. This is your host, Sly Dude. I want to thank you for watching. We'll see you in the forum, and we'll see you next week.